Can you talk about how you got your foot in the comic writing industry? I mean, obviously, like a lot of people say, if you want to go to the film industry, you have to go to LA. If you want to get into theater, you have to go to New York. But writing's a bit different because you can kind of do it anywhere.
Yeah, it can be tough. You can, in theory, do it anywhere. I think it's important for someone who's really trying to break in to do networking and to go to try to go to conventions, network not only with editors and publishers but with other creators as well, because comics is a collaborative medium. It's always going to you're always going to rely on other people unless you're one of those very, very lucky and talented people who can do it all themselves. But networking's important, and for me that was tough. I didn't have the money to travel to a lot of conventions. I was painfully introverted to the point that even if I were at conventions, I couldn't speak to anybody. So it was and I didn't know how to approach these people about getting into comics. My real break came, I was working at a comic shop, and one of my co-workers was an aspiring artist named Brian Hurt. And we started talking about me telling stories and him drawing stories, and we talked about doing comics together. From while we were working together, we were talking about doing our own comics. It took about 10 years or so to make that actually happen. And then we did a comic book together that was published through Oni Press. It was called The Damned. And then we did another book called The Sixth Gun. And that just kept those books started opening doors for me. So, for a writer, probably a writer of comics, the toughest thing, maybe tougher than finding a publisher, is finding an artist who's willing to work with you on some of your creator-owned ideas. So I got very lucky in that I found an incredibly talented artist early on while working at a comic shop. And then when we did our first project, we just turned it on to let's do the next thing. When we were doing other projects. And I've worked with Brian now. I've been working with Brian since that time. So it's just a matter of making those connections. You really have no idea who, which connection, who you're going to talk to. You don't know who is going to be that one that really helps you get your foot in the door.
It's almost like you're saying you should be nice to everybody.
Look, I don't think I've ever been accused of being nice to everyone, but you should treat people with respect. Look, I've been to plenty of conventions where I see the people, I call them badge watchers. They look at your badge, and if they don't see that you're an editor or a publisher, you're not important enough to talk to, and they move on to someone else. And that's really narrow-minded because, and it's a great example here with Shadow Man. Heather and I connected when she was a fan. She wasn't working in comics. She was a fan of comics. And that's when we first connected and started talking. And then later she was working with Marvel, and later she was working with Valiant. So you really, these people that, everyone you meet, you never know when that, when that's going to turn into something. Yeah. I used to work in career management, and networking was a big part of it. And I used to train people, and I'd always tell them, don't network with the intention of, hey, can you get me a job? Can you get me a job? Can you get me a job? Because the answer is going to be invariably, no, I don't know you. But if you network with the intention of, hey, these people might have shared interests, I could actually talk to these people and enjoy their company. Forget the career aspect of it. Think about trying to meet people and make friends. That's the essence of networking.
We spoke about this a little bit before with the characters, but as far as publisher goes, does having a smaller publisher open up more for you creatively? Are they more flexible? Do you get to make the series longer than you would for a more major publisher like Marvel or DC?
Well, I definitely think there's more flexibility with Valiant, especially with this character. As far as the series, look, Valiant knows I have big plans for Shadow Man, and it could go many issues. The tough part with that is, and you know, the first question you get asked every time a new series starts is this a limited series or an ongoing series? And the dirty truth of it all is every series is a limited series unless people support it and read it and like it. So I have plans for Shadow Man that could be very very long plans and could have big impact, and well, even in the first few arcs will have big impact in the Valiant universe. But the truth of it is, I'd love to write Shadow Man for years and years to come. It all depends on if readers are digging it and want to support the book.
Do you think with, like, you know, big film franchises, you know, the new term cinematic universes, do you think that's helped more kids get into comics?
I think it's probably brought some into comics. I don't think it brings as many as we necessarily want it to, obviously. But I do think that exposes people who've never read comics to the medium and gets them to check it out. I actually think television probably helps with that even more than TV, because television is there's something once a week during the season and it just keeps it top of mind. And yeah, I mean, if you look at, there are definitely books out there that have benefited greatly from very successful TV shows. I would love to think it brings in more people, but I don't know that we found that magic bullet yet that brings in just tons of readers because of the movie or TV show.
No, it's funny you nailed it, because like what got me into comics was a 90s X-Men cartoon. I didn't even know it was a comic, and then that opened a whole door for me with Spider-Man and Avengers, and eventually the Batman animated series as well. Like, all that stuff got me into comics, and I started reading at a very young age because of that, when I had money to buy them.
Well, yeah, and and so I think it's, I still think there's work to be done to figure out how you remind someone who goes and sees one of these, mega blockbusters. How do we remind them that, hey, these characters are based on a comic, and there are decades of stories available for you to read. If you really enjoyed this, there's a lot more out there for you to read and enjoy.
Do you think it's interesting overall, the idea of a cinematic universe? Do you think that funnels like the creativity down because you kind of stuck, this person is this superhero and you have to always use this person and he always has to look like this, where in comics, if there's an arc and then the next arc there's a new artist and writer, so it could be completely different. Like, what are your thoughts about that as a creative?
Look, I grew up in an era where I loved these long creative runs on a character, and I loved when the characters in a Marvel book interacted with the other characters, and when it's snowing in a Spider-Man book, it's snowing in the Thor book, and I love that kind of cross connectivity. It takes a lot, especially when you get into a lot of books. It takes a lot of oversight to keep up with when it's snowing in the Thor comic and it's supposed to be snowing in the Spider-Man comic. And I think there's an art form to that on the editorial side, and it can be very difficult to keep up with. And for the writers, I think it's fun if I like the idea that, hey, the editor calls me and says, hey, it's snowing in this book. It needs to be, maybe we can have it snowing in your book. I think those are fun little exercises, and those are fun entries into other parts of the universe. But it's when it becomes every arc is a crossover. that's a difficult ask to telling great stories, because those giant crossovers so often are written in a room and written by committee, and it's tough to be the guy who, to be one of the people who is trying to dance between the raindrops of a giant crossover.
Can you talk about what are that's a good answer. I remember New 42 was when that came out, I was like, I can't, there's so much happening, I can't. Every book was I was like, oh my god, every book was interconnected. I was very overwhelmed, but it was interesting. But yeah, a lot going on in the editorial side. When you're writing a character that's been around for 10 or 20 years, they've kind of already been developed. How do you put your own spin on them? Do you put them in different situations? Do you add new characters that have never been seen before? Like, how do you put your stamp on it?
Yeah, so first of all, when I'm asked to do these projects, and in the old days, I would have taken whatever project someone asked me to do, because it's this desperation of who knows how long this career is going to last, and 13-year-old Cullen would slap me if I turned down a run on whatever book it was he was reading at the time. But nowadays, I focus more on when I talk to editors about doing a book. I really have to think about, can I add something to this character? Can I add something and do something different with them? And if the answer to that is probably not, then I don't do the book. Shadow Man, I knew right away. I had a take on the character, and a lot of it. Yes, there are some changes in the character, mainly because the previous arc, the previous series, left him in a place where his powers were changing. So, but they didn't explore that at all. So I had that to go on right away. Shadow Man's powers are different, and that's a little bit of a different approach to the character. But then mainly in terms of mood and theme, the challenges Shadow Man's facing, and just my general approach to how I'm scripting the book was very, I thought was very different from what readers of Shadow Man in the past have seen. And then John Davis Hunt draws the book in such a way he looks completely different from what Shadow Man has been what a Shadow Man book has looked like in the past. So I think it gives us a great opportunity to have this sort of fresh take on the character.
Some books, are fantasy. You have like people with superpowers, and grounded in science. Others are dark and don't have any powers. What is having the world of Shadow Man with its voodoo and its magic open up for you creatively to explore that?
So there's a big mythology, that Valiant's mystical side is a big mythology that I was able to explore and play with and change and advance in different ways. But Shadow Man also gives me a great opportunity to really explore very different subgenres of horror, in that we have sort of these, some issues are very cosmic horror, some are very sort of visceral, some are like the slasher genre. And I really wanted every issue of Shadow Man to have sort of a different horrific angle. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really having fun with the book about, is how each issue feels very different from the last in terms of really just the type of story we're telling. There is an overarching storyline, but I also feel like, especially in the first several issues, a reader could pick up any issue of Shadow Man and jump right in and enjoy the story. And every issue has a beginning, middle, and end. So that you can read it standalone issue and move forward to whatever you're doing next.
It's interesting. So it's almost you've had to make like all concise stories in each issue. Like you were talking about arcs earlier, where like you have a 10-book arc and it tells one gigantic story, but this one you're telling, I don't know, however X amount of segmented stories individually. Right. Is that more difficult?
Yeah, it's a lot more difficult, and I knew it when I pitched that idea. I knew I was asking for trouble. That it's a giant pain. Telling a one and done story is not easy. I think they're very difficult, and it reminds me of the days of old. Boy, those writers who were doing one and done stories several times, doing several of them each month. They were some very, very gifted people. But yeah, I just thought it was an interesting approach. I wanted this book to be something that if you read issue 3, you could enjoy it, and you haven't read issues 1 and 2, and you don't have to feel lost. Now, like I said, there is sort of storylines that tie into it, and or that tie into a bigger storyline. And so you'll see glimpses of things in each issue that lead to something bigger. But even, you know, my hope is even when we get really into the nitty gritty of that bigger storyline, I would like every issue to feel as if it has a solid beginning, middle, and end, even if it's really in the trenches of this bigger storyline.